they're connected. So just briefly, Matt Segall is a process philosopher teaching at the California Institute for Integral Studies and specializing in Alfred North Whitehead and German idealism, Schelling in particular. Dr. Bruce Damer is the director and chief scientist at the Biogenic Institute and has spent a number of years pursuing the questions as to how life began and how we can give life a sustainable path forward into the cosmos. So we'll introduce Dr. Bruce Damer first. The paper title they've given is The Cosmological Context for the Origin of Life, Process Philosophy and the Hot Spring Hypothesis. Bruce.
Thank you, Andrew. This is my first philosophy meeting, so I'm just deeply getting steeped, or like a bag of tea in a big pot. I'm just kind of absorbing all of it. So I may make many misstatements or missteps. But what I hope to do is to bring you some of the amazing news from the field, from Origin of Life, which has had breakthroughs in the last decade or so. It's sort of on a tear at the moment. And part of the breakthrough is, I would say, from Mother Earth. This, and I'm going to hand this around, this is a stromatolite. It's the, when you hold it, feel free to hold it, look at it, give it a sniff. It's the oldest evidence for life on Earth. This is from Australia, from the northwest, from the Tumbiana location, Tumbiana in the so-called Pilbara Proton. And these little ridges here are the sequestration of sand grains by microbial gnat communities 3 billion years ago. And this is a lacustrine stromatolite. It's from a lake shore. So picture a long lake on a big volcanic craton. It's very stinky because these are metabolizing what they have, and they're also sequestering iron. They're oxidizing iron, so it's very heavy red.
What does it taste like?
It's kind of grainy. But I'm going to hand this around, and you can kind of touch this and feel this while the talk happens. So it's amazing. You're holding the oldest thing you probably will touch in your lifetime. We're very fortunate to have this tiny amount of Earth's crust from the Paleoarchean that's left, where we can find evidence of our ancestors. And this is what kind of rock textures we're looking for on Mars with Mars 2020 Perseverance. So with that, I'll get going. So we're going to cover 3 considerations of the so-called hot spring hypothesis that Dave Deamer and I developed and put into print over the last several years. There's an empirical aspect to it, but there's then a conjectural aspect because it's a very much more complex consideration of life's beginning than has ever been proposed in the history of science. And therefore, it dives into a metaphysical aspect. Because when you get that complexity, that opacity, that difficulty that the scientists are going, really? How do we get our heads around it? I think enter philosophers, especially the metaphysics, which I was very deeply attracted to the metaphysics of Alfred North Whitehead. Both of us, when Matt and I met 3 years ago, just went click. There's something here. So empirical, just briefly, what are the plausible scenarios with supporting experimental evidence surrounding the mystery of life's origination on the Earth and on exoplanets, on other worlds? And how can, this current paradigm shift is going on from 30 years of investigating the possibility of life starting at hydrothermal vents in the oceans. The field has largely abandoned that and is now working on pools on land. And that's a paradigm shift, a revolution in our field, which is also an opening for philosophy to participate. It's a confusing kind of reorientation time in our field. And so what the field is now focusing on is cycling freshwater pools on land. And it does open up this potential collaboration, this transition period. Charles Darwin had the intuition of this in 1871 in this little phrase, famous phrase in a letter to T.J. Hooker. And everybody knows the first part of it. In some warm little pond somewhere with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present. So everyone knows the warm little pond reference. But this is now coming to the fore, the second part of the sentence, that a protein compound was chemically formed ready to undergo still more complex changes. He nailed it in 1871. That's called an away from equilibrium system, or a kinetic trap, where a polymer is formed and can grow in length and in complexity in some cycling system. This was in front of us for 125, 150 years as of last year. So what we are pointing to is you have to have a system capable of forming polymers, in this case he's referring to proteins, long enough to do jobs and enable them to grow more complex. The whole system has to not just wind down, get all broken up. So this is what we think this warm little 21st century version of a warm little pond would look like. This is a depiction of a Hadean landscape 4 billion years ago. Lots of volcanoes, lots of hot spring activity. So you can hear it now. And the action happens at the edge of the pool, at the air-water mineral interface. Still, in life today, the most complex environment for life, the most dynamic environment, is at shorelines. It's at that interface. So what happens there? How does this work? Well, a lot of science is now showing that we have abundant organics. Even the 5 nucleobases have been discovered on the Murchison meteorite, or on carbonaceous chondrites. So you have abundant sources in the dusty disk of the solar system coming in fall, as well as potentially a biogenic atmosphere generating all the organics which will accumulate on land, rather than if they fall in the ocean, they get dispersed. And they will accumulate to concentrations high enough for chemistry to occur. And in a cycling system, you get the pump, you get the action to drive them forward. And what you're producing initially are protocells. This is the general term in our field for the self-assembled membranous compartment that has stuff in it that then can be subject to selection. This is what it looks like under a microscope. This is what derivatives of a carbonaceous meteorite, grind them up, put them in solution, and the membranes form spontaneously. This was a discovery by my colleague Dave Deemer in the 1980s. So what is this setting up for us? It's setting up a roulette wheel where each of the balls is a protocell that contains, you can see these are stains, you can actually see the intercalating dye is showing that we have contents of polymers in there, and we're cycling between wet and dry, and we just get more of these blobs under the microscope with more contents and more polymers. And then they're subject to selection by the trillions or the quadrillions in solution, very large numbers. And so this is how the cycle works. You have a little pool, or even a cleft in the rock, or a single droplet on a basaltic surface that dries down. It concentrates all of this material that is raining from the skies, and you get these layered forms. Hundreds to thousands of layers of lipid. And in between the layers, you can get something called a condensation reaction to happen, where water's leaving, like a sponge, like a dish sponge, where you squeeze it out. And then what's left behind are these building blocks. And the building blocks say, hey, water's gone, we can click together, and we get RNA-like polymers, even DNA self-assembling, and peptide self-assembling. And this has become the great discovery of the last decade, and dozens of teams now worldwide are using wet-dry cycling to make these biopolymers of life. And then you get a hydration event, a single droplet from a pipetter, or an inflow of water, or even humidification, and the system buds off these protocells, these compartments, some of which have the polymers in them. And as the system dries down and concentrates, you get a gel that forms, an amalgam, an aggregation of the protocells that fuse back together, dump the polymers back into the system, and then the polymers mix. And they compete for new monomers, and they grow longer, just like Darwin called for, and then they bud off again. And so you get multiple potentials for selection going on in a prebiotic system. Selection's there from the beginning. So what we call this is this wet-dry cycling is this engine, this combinatorial engine. This is before genes. There are no traits to select for. It's all physical. So the wet-dry cycle, what Matt's going to introduce is these little elements in here that could be considered a kind of concrescence. And that Matt will cover that later. And all of these occasions that are happening in continuous flow, in continuous network, indivisible, is the whole system standing itself up. So this is me in the first time we went out into the field to try the whole experiment from the laboratory. This is in Rotorua, New Zealand, in June of 2018, and we repeated the experiments just before COVID. We were lucky to get out of New Zealand. And here are our vials, and they contain mixtures of monomers of RNA. Some have salts, a lot of them have lipids. And this is when I take the vial out, I can see the layers. There they are. You can see them with the naked eye. When we put the system through TLC or gel electrophoresis, this is our laboratory products. This is something called a ladder, which tells you the length of the polymers you're getting. So that's 100 units long. And we can compare this smudge here with that smudge there. We're getting more polymers, more RNA, up to 500 MERS in length from the hot spring product than we are getting in the lab. So the hot spring was more productive than the laboratory water, which is a huge, huge revelation for us. It worked better in nature. So we've demonstrated, and many teams have now demonstrated, the self-assembly and encapsulation of all of the major molecular species of life. And recently, a colleague in Denmark took our samples and ran the wet-dry cycling inside an atomic force microscope, which is in a vacuum, and was able to see, and this is in a publication last year, ring structures. And this is RNA, like an Ouroboros, connecting to its tail and forming these rings. And these are hundreds of chain lengths long. And recently, we've now a new publication showing long strands, thousands of chain lengths long, from the monomers. And so this is like a physical, visible evidence. We also run these through our nanopore sequencing technology, and we actually can count the bases. They're all random. There's no function to it, but they're there. So that's the AFM. This is from 3 months ago in Fly Geyser with the BBC, actually, up in northern Nevada. This is the Little Pot Geyser up in the Nevada desert. We're repeating the experiments again, and this time we're using open slides so we can study what's happening directly. If you look here, this is pure nucleotide. This is with the water from the hot spring with silica mineral in it. And there's layer upon layer upon layer. This is our multilamellar complex right here. And when we put it under the microscope, we stain it, and this is RNA, some of it's DNA, and even dipeptides. And that's why it's glowing like this. So it's this unit, this complex, which is not simple, it's complex, where we think life can begin in this environment. And we're coming up with a new term. You heard that we come up with this term, durability. The next term we're going to propose is progenitor. This sludge, this bathtub ring of material into which life can emerge. And Matt's going to introduce Whitehead's idea of the sheltered environment. And that's another one of the linking points that we found with the science. And that this happens in a wide range of hydrothermal environments: acidic, neutral, temperature up to 90 degrees, 60 degrees C, a high silica content. As we go out in the field, we find that the durable zone for this kind of chemistry is actually wider than we thought. So now we're going to jump into the speculative, because this is what we've proven so far. This is where we think we can go in the next, say, 50 years of this work. And the question is this physiochemical artifact, a potential progenitor to life and all the processes it can undergo, sufficient to transform self-assembling protocells into the first microbial communities? The whole thing rises as a single unit. A cell doesn't emerge, a community emerges and becomes the stromatolite. So the origin of life is truly communal, indivisible. It's not individual cells, and they're not in competition in the beginning either. because there's no technology to compete. It's all the collaborative consortia, being the micro term. But the question is, are methodological and philosophical tools and frameworks up to the task of reifying the progenitor? Make it in the lab, study it, cycle it, poke it, prod it, use synthetic biology, trying to get evolution to kick into it. Can we do it in the lab? And can we therefore enter the complexity chasm of molecular evolution toward life? It's a long distance to the dividing first cell. There's a lot of tools that have to emerge through selection. So we come with a new term, combinatorial selection, going toward Darwinian evolution, because we do not have genes yet, but genes will emerge. Some sort of information storage will emerge, and the prediction is that this system will generate protocells that have accumulate and stack properties, selected functional polymers that lead up to the eventual duplication and division of material and the formation of daughter cells, when there is now identity, cellular identity emerges in the progenome. So this is from our original publication. So we're predicting that the sets of function emerge starting with stability, which we've proven. Pores, another group is now working on. A form of metabolism, a lot of teams are working on. Stuart Kaufman calls them autocatalytic sets. Catalysis, catalytic. Replication, we're working on short DNA strands that are melted by the high water. They're separated by high water temperatures, and then templating can occur. And you get templating forms of replication, which is not coding, but it's the first step. Feedback controls, the hidden function of biology, keeping the rates of reactions within ranges. That can only happen really through evolution. And the prediction is that each of these functions doesn't arise in an individual protocell, it arises in a population that's deeply interconnected, deeply networked. And it's initially a cooperative system. So if we're putting it all together, hot spring origin of life, this was a diagram that took about 5 years to develop with our colleagues, setting the setting of this. So the synthesis of the organics, initially, because life doesn't know how to make its own organics. They accumulate in these environments, which are very, very diverse. One might be alkaline, one might be acidic, so you get products mixing, concentration. You have a cycling system that's a pump, that's an engine, maybe driven by geyser inflow or other processes. You get this wheel turning. You get distribution. That's very key, that the whole landscape is participating in life's origin, not just one pool. It's a landscape where there's distribution by water and by wind, believe it or not. And adaptation to tougher environments like the saline seashore, where membranes disflocculate, they crash if you don't have a way to get the salt out. And it's like when you eat a big bag of chips, you need to drink water. Colonization of the earth occurs in the marine environment, then the oceans are colonized, not the other way around. And the rock record bears this out. This is geyserite from Northwest Australia, showing the oldest clear evidence of microbial communities. This is the lacustrine that you're touching, the sample that you have, and this is a marine stromatolite from slightly later. So the rock record is bearing this out. The paradigm shift is well underway. This was our first public proposal in the Scientific American of 2017. They did a wonderful job on the cycling spiral of complexity, growing and growing. There's sort of Whiteheadian process overtones in that. Astrobiology ran a cover article for our full hypothesis 2 years ago. And Nature has been taking this up quite a lot as the paradigm, as the controversy has sort of raged in the last 2 years, the so-called water paradox. You can't be in water when you're forming the biopolymers of life because they get broken down by water. You need enzymes, but there are no enzymes, so it's a chicken or egg situation. So that's why the chemists have departed the ocean origin scenario. The implications for astrobiology and as the previous speaker mentioned, orbital worlds that can start life. We worked with the Spirit rover team, and then we were on the Mars 2020 landing site selection process, and Spirit found an opaline silica deposit at Columbia Hills about 15 years ago, an actual hot spring on Mars, about of an age 3.7 billion years. And these digitate opaline silica structures, which if you see them in Chile next to hot springs, they contain evidence for life, microbial evidence for life. So that was we did not go back with the new rover to that location. The proposal that we then came up with to start any form of life, this is sort of a generic theory of the origin of life, you have to be able to encapsulate and subject to combinatorial selection chain polymers. Some that are catalytic, that fold and do jobs, some that have information. Whatever chemistry you pick has to be able to do that trick, and then you have to get pre-Darwinian selection going. So,
Bruce, about 20 minutes.
okay. So life can start on early Mars and other similar Europa worlds, but it can't in a world that lacks wet dry cycling. You just can't make the polymers. So that goes to your earlier question. So this may be habitable. This may have been seeded from life in other places, but it's inurable. You can't start life. So the metaphysical. I'm going to finish up with this so Matt can get going. This is where we jump off into your department. Can we derive linkages between the empirical and conjectural progenitor, which is the subject of our chapter, and process and organic thought of Whitehead and others? And can this linkage serve both parties? Can it help guide the next step of the science? But can progenitors that are made in the laboratory, poked and prodded and studied, can they be a laboratory for process philosophical proposals? A testable laboratory, an artifact. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the progenitor? We're talking about the unit, in a sense, the philosopher's stone, which carries through this process matter from physics through to biology. So in the abstract, what it's doing is it's compartmentalizing objects that would never otherwise get together into a membranous enclosure that they can get in and out of to some degree, increasing the probability of their association. Then, if you have these enclosures next to each other, some transmission of products can occur between the objects, forming a nodal system, which is new in the universe, network systems. This leads to properties that emerge as you get larger and larger systems, a probability increase of chemical reactions, a bigger internetworking because a reaction here can diffuse products over here, which can start something that comes back here. And that can lead to the emergence of memory through cycling. The template emerges, is selected in this system, and so that you have access to linear memory stores which can store traits. So this is the order that we think it would occur. And so the algorithmic abstraction of life's origins is a probability shaping. You got to increase that probability by crowding like we're doing here at this conference. You've got to allow interaction to happen, and you've got to remember systems for the next round, like we're doing here at this conference. Or all, in a sense, this PIM formalism is happening at every scale. And so the question being, is life a unique occurrence in cosmic history? This is sort of a Whiteheadian question. I would say yes, in that it adds a novel instructional coding and internetworking capability, which blueprints for traits enables rapid adaptation, so that living organisms express greater creative potential than what came before. I think we can agree on that. So biology in the loop just stacks complexity. And lastly, this is I call this the epilogue. This is sort of a more visionary treatment of it. How do we put the origin of life as an event between cosmogenesis and, say, consciousness? So this is a dream I had one night, sketched it out, sent it off to my colleague in Australia who did this graphic of it, and I hope it's entertaining at least, if not informative. But in the dream I said, what is driving the whole process? And the answer was the rising of the sun every day, and the incident solar radiation is the pump. It's the reliable energy that is lifting and jacking the system up. And there's 4 billion years of that. So what happens? Well, we get the precursor, we get the Big Bang, generating enough heavy metals for geology to be there, hard rock geology, origin of life happening in a cycling system that continues to be jacked up day by day by day and continues to run through the microbial epoch, which is very long. We end up with fungi, animals, and plants after a very, very long search space has happened. Nervous systems, which are an extreme level of adaptation in the lifetime of an organism. Then something like self-awareness, that some of these organisms see themselves as objects, as entities that are distinct. And then perhaps consciousness or awareness of the whole origin story, maybe sort of a higher level consciousness. And that this entire thing is on a 4 billion year high potential stack. And that there are residues that are created that are informational and internet connecting, network symbolic, and a lot of detritus that's all around us. The progenitor is 50%, the progenitor is 50% detritus and maybe 50% life. And that this immense system, which includes bioelectric impulses, pheromones, broken up trash, weather patterns, everything is connecting us in ways we don't know yet. And there may be sort of an electron of experience that is from life itself, that when we detect the kind of dense web that we're in, it'll explain a lot of things, even for parapsychological phenomena. It's all explainable because of this immense sort of akashic field that has grown around life. It's been added to continuously, and now with technology we're just adding so many more artifacts. It's so dense. And so that's an emergentist approach to what we're inside. So with that, I'd like to thank the conference organizers and welcome Matt to the stage. Experience was level 3.
Thanks so much, Bruce, for laying out the empirical hypothesis, the hot spring progenitor environment. When I met Bruce a few years ago and heard him describe this, all the Whiteheadian light bulbs were going off. And I'm going to try to share some of those insights with you. So we ended up writing about an 80-page paper together, and I'm going to try to highlight some of the key features of this collaboration. You just heard from Bruce about the empirical hypothesis. I'm going to be talking about the metaphysical implications. I'm going to be leveraging the conceptual innovations of Whitehead's organic realism to overcome the quandaries of both standard physicalism as well as Kantian transcendentalism, I'll go into that in a minute, by better defining the cosmological conditions of life's origin. In particular, the progenitor scenario of the hot spring hypothesis is interpreted as a special exemplification of Whitehead's more general metaphysical account of the production of evolutionary novelty, both via environmental sheltering. This term sheltering is a term Whitehead develops in processing reality, as well as the process of concrescence. So here's Whitehead, and I think it's important to begin by introducing his critique of what he called the bifurcation of nature. So much hinges for Whitehead and his philosophy of organism on understanding this bifurcation. Often people will think that Whitehead's trying to insert subjectivity into nature, to insert experience into nature, when really he's trying to critique the materialistic movement that took it out when the scientific revolution started, which helped to simplify matters, to do measurement and quantification without any subjectivity or mind mixed in with the observed material world. But Whitehead's saying now that we've advanced, especially through quantum and relativity theories, but in the biological domain, we've got to put experience and subjectivity back into nature to understand what's going on. So he says, the effect of this sharp division between nature and life, you could say between object and subject, if you want, has poisoned all subsequent philosophy. Even when the coordinate existence of the two types of actualities is abandoned, there is no proper fusion of the two in most modern schools of thought. For some, nature is mere appearance, and mind is the sole reality. So this is the idealist point of view. I don't have time to go into the intricacies of Kant's transcendental form of idealism, but the basic idea would be all of our knowledge of nature is limited to the phenomenal realm. The mind is the source of all of the categories, space, the categories like causality, substance, and so on, and our forms of intuition provide space and time. All of this is the mind imposing a structure on something unknown, and the filtering of the mind produces the phenomenal display of nature, and science is just studying this display. That would be the idealist view, right? So nature becomes mere appearance. For others, for the materialists, physical nature is the sole reality, and mind is an epiphenomenon. Here the phrases mere appearance and epiphenomenon obviously carry the implication of slight importance for the understanding of the final nature of things. Whitehead, as a kind of radical empiricist, really despises the idea of the philosophy of nothing but. I think this is in the Gilchrist phrase, nothing buttery, right? If you're dismissing nature as a mere appearance, that's a problem. If you're dismissing mind as a mere epiphenomenon, that's a problem, right? So we need to fuse the two together in Whitehead's view. So he says the doctrine I am maintaining is that neither physical nature nor life can be understood unless we fuse them together as essential factors in the composition of really real things, whose interconnections and individual characters constitute the universe, right? So from my point of view, if we accept a materialist ontology, consciousness, human consciousness, becomes a kind of miracle, right? You can say it emerged, but there's a lot of hand-waving about how exactly you can get phenomenal consciousness, agency, and so on out of a merely material process, right? So consciousness becomes a miracle in a materialist ontology. If idealism is true, then evolution becomes a sort of mirage, right? Because time is just a form of intuition provided by our own sensory apparatus, right? And so rather than consciousness being a miracle, evolution being a mirage, I think Whitehead's pan-experientialism allows us to naturalize both consciousness and evolution. No miracles, no mirages, right? It's all real. So Whitehead says, reportedly by Lucian Price, if we take his word for it, in dialogue with Whitehead, Whitehead said, "I am a thoroughgoing evolutionist." Whitehead thought materialism and evolution were incompatible, right? Because in materialism, you're rearranging pre-existing parts. There's really no novelty produced. So Whitehead says, "I'm a thoroughgoing evolutionist. Millions of years ago, our Earth began to cool off and forms of life began in their simplest aspects. Where did they come from? They must have existed in potentiality in the most minutest particles. First of this fiery and later of this watery and earthy planet. So cellular life had to be possible before it was actual." Seems obvious, but what is this possibility? Where is the potential prior to its actualization, right? And so another way of framing this question is, what are the cosmological conditions for the origin of life? Now, metaphysics, Whitehead says that, many scientists have to say that they dislike metaphysics, but what they really mean is they don't like having their own metaphysics questioned.
That's right.
So, like Greta Thunberg, when she encounters politicians, scientists tend to, their eyes glaze over when philosophers bring up metaphysics, but I think the fact of the matter is, from my perspective as a philosopher, scientific knowledge is not self-grounding. So metaphysics has a crucial role to play in shoring up the epistemological and cosmological conditions of science's own possibility, right? Whitehead asks, what is there in the nature of things which leads there to be any science? His answer is that trust in science requires a metaphysics explanatory of the insistent rationality of things. He actually credits Kant with recognizing the importance of this problem. What are the epistemological conditions that make science possible? Right? He disagrees with where Kant ends up, but he thinks that we've sort of, in the last few hundred years, as science has advanced in its capacity to develop instrumental knowledge, know how to manipulate the natural world, make predictions, and get expected results, we've produced a vision of the universe that makes our own presence in it as scientific knowers rather improbable, if not miraculous. So for Whitehead, cosmic rationality is a consequence of the inextricable causal entanglement of every entity. He says there's an essence to the universe which forbids relationships beyond itself as a violation of its rationality. So for Whitehead, rationality really comes to mean relationality, you might say. Natural science thus assumes the universal communicability of the causal nexus across all scales of nature: physical, biological, psychological, sociological. Natural science assumes that the causal nexus is continuous, even if novel agencies or regnant monads emerge with each level of organization. That's a whole other can of worms, I won't go into that right now. So science further presupposes that conscious organisms, such as ourselves, have arisen within this nexus who are capable of turning back to contemplate our own cosmic origins. It's imperative then that a way be found for scientific conceptions of physical causation, chemical reaction, and biological origination to hang together with our common sense experience of conscious awareness and agency. For after all, if our consciousness is a total sham, then so are all our scientific inquiries. Consciousness must somehow, as Whitehead puts it, have truck with the totality of things. And it is the job of philosophy to critique and reconstruct the abstractions of the special sciences so as to recover a concrete sense of our connection with the cosmos as a whole. Now, this relationship between philosophy and science, or metaphysics and science, does go in both directions. Metaphysics can be the critic of abstractions of the special sciences, but obviously Whitehead, as a radical empiricist, wants to follow the developments of the sciences and generalize certain findings to see if they apply across different domains, right? Different special sciences, but also in the domains of human experience and aesthetics and religious experience and so on. So we heard from Bruce about the wet-dry cycling. And for those of you who are familiar with Whiteheadian metaphysics, you may have already detected some resonances with Whitehead's account of concrescence, right? Or the process whereby novelty is produced over the course of evolutionary time. Whitehead describes his metaphysics as a cell theory of actuality, right? So he's using biological metaphors here. In Function of Reason, Whitehead says the way of rhythm pervades all life. And indeed, all physical existence begins with the vibration of electromagnetic, of electrons, of atoms. Right after the Big Bang, you have really no enduring forms yet until, as Whitehead describes it, these vibratory patterns begin to harmonize with each other to give rise to the first societies or organisms, you could say, that have endurance over time. And at this early stage in the universe, it's very apparent that the organism, say the electrons, are not separate from the environment, right? The unit of evolution is an organism-environment. That's true at this very early stage of the universe's evolution as much as it is at the origin of life on our planet and perhaps others. Okay, perfect. So Whitehead's metaphysically generic account of concrescence finds special application in the production of novelty achieved via the combinatorial selection of polymer-filled protocells, as described in the hot spring hypothesis. So Whitehead does actually develop the concept of the cycle, also in Function of Reason, which contemporary biochemists have scientifically elaborated into concepts including thermodynamic work cycles, autocatalytic hypercycles, hypercyclic cooperative networks, and the dehydration-rehydration cycles that Bruce was describing for us. So for those who aren't familiar, concrescence is Whitehead's description, which I'm kind of animating in this cartoon here, of the iterative, cumulative process whereby novelty emerges over the course of cosmic evolution. Each cycle of concrescence commences as objective beings in the past environment grow together into a new subjective becoming or occasion of experience. Again, occasion in a profoundly generalized sense, not conscious, as Derek was emphasizing earlier. The objects of the perished past are felt or prehended by the concressing occasion and brought into harmony with its subjective aim and intensity of satisfaction. depending on the complexity of the surrounding environment, a given occasion of experience's subjective aim can achieve varying grades of experiential intensity. And in this way, what Aristotle would call the formal and final causation operative in concrescence. Whitehead would speak in terms of subjective form and subjective aim. These formal and final causes are limited by the environment and context that provide the efficient causes out of which they arise. So Whitehead's not eliminating mechanism, right? He's complementing it. Once the subjective satisfaction has been achieved, the concrescent entity perishes into a superjective phase, thereby adding whatever novelty is achieved back to the local environment for subsequent cycles of concrescence to inherit. So if we shift then from Whitehead's generic metaphysical account back to the special case of the progenitor scenario, we can see, hopefully, how as a new wet phase commences, each lipid-encased protocell that buds off from the layers formed during the dry phase amounts to a chemical experiment incorporating whatever polymer chains were achieved in the last cycle for further testing. These buds are like Whitehead's drops of experience, complex and interdependent, with each cycle of concrescence achieving greater chemical stability and driving the accumulation of further functionality. All right, so final slide here, sort of the take home from what I've shared here and the overall points of our chapter together. Process philosophers are well aware the mechanistic world picture is broken down. We live in a self-organizing universe. One of the implications of applying a process philosophical orientation to origin of life science is that we remove the need for any ontological gaps between physics, chemistry, and biology. These are different disciplines that human scientists organize themselves into, but the universe doesn't come broken into these disciplinary boundaries, right? There's an evolutionary continuum here. Whitehead also says that life is a matter of degree, and for him, life implies feelings and aims, and so the potentiality for life was present even before biological cells emerged. Therefore, some form, Whitehead would say, of minimal feeling or prehension and aim was present before biological cells emerged. And if aim is too much of a teleological heavy lift for you, just think of it in terms of directionality. At the prebiotic physical level, we're talking about the directionality of time. And there's thermodynamic reasons to think that the directionality of time is actually real, even if some equations in physics, it doesn't matter which direction time flows. For thermodynamics, it does. And for Whitehead's view of time as a cumulative process, all you need is a directionality there. And for him, that would be akin to a kind of aim, which only becomes more manifest and apparent once you get biological cells who are realizing functions and become agents in their own evolution. Right? We can talk about Darwinian selection as a passive selection of the environment. We can talk about Whiteheadian evolution as the aims of the organism. They become agents in their own evolution, constructing niches and so on. There's also Baldwinian evolution, which is very similar here, because maybe Neo-Lamarckian is triggering Baldwin had a view of organisms as agents in their own evolution too. We could call it Baldwinian evolution as well. So wrapping up here, science finds itself in need of a general theory of evolution. I think Whitehead's account of concrescence gives us a way of describing the production of novelty across all of these scales, physical, biological, and human cultural, where the process of concrescence is akin to a kind of selection process in an almost Darwinian way, where you get reproduction with variation that is inherited by the next generation of actual occasions. And so there's maybe a little bit of aim in there, but there's also plenty of room for error and mutation in a Darwinian sense that then would be inherited by the next generation of actual occasions that might prove useful in the changed environment that they arise within. And so the other important point here, which I've described to Bruce as a kind of figure ground shift that I think is implied by the hot spring hypothesis. It's the idea that the search for the origin of cellular life is the search for an environment capable of sheltering the origin of cellular life, right? So rather than this reductionistic focus on how an individual cell is going to figure out all the chemical tricks to make it happen, we should be looking for the environment that could shelter, in Whitehead's terms, the complexity required to generate these biological functions. So, in Whitehead, sheltering and the role of environments in protecting what is within them from the chaos around them, the background of chaos. This process begins, as the first enduring forms of order emerge in the universe with electrons and then atoms, who are providing stable forms of order that then act as a platform for more complex forms to emerge later. And so what is the environment capable of sheltering the origin of life? It is this freshwater hot spring environment, but it's also the moon and its orbits and the sun and the radiation it's providing, and also that's spatially, but also temporally, the temporal environment, the whole history of the universe, and all the stacking complexity that went into this process. So this is part of the figure ground shift that I see at work in Bruce's hypothesis, Bruce and colleagues. So I'll end there. Hopefully we have time for some questions.
Okay, so we are on task time-wise. Let's take a few questions, and then we'll take a small break, and Dr. Conacher's presentation will begin promptly at 11. So if we do have a few minutes for questions, after which have some coffee out in the sun, and we can continue the discussion. Or not, I'll let you or Bruce field some of the questions.
I'd like to thank you guys for putting this together. It looks like a microcosm of what the whole conference is trying to do. Bruce, I'm just fascinated with the research that you posed, but I want to ask you a question about electricity. And Erasmus Darwin, already in the 1790s, said electricity is the key to the origin of life, and Mary Shelley picked that up in 1817 with Frankenstein. Then Erasmus's grandson, Charles Darwin, gave us the quote in 1871, which included electricity, and the Miller-Urey experiments from 1952 also, we got lightning bolts. I noticed that was not in your account. Does electricity play any role in the theory that you developed?
Very much. In fact, our colleagues who developed the alkaline hydrothermal vent hypothesis, what they're talking about is gradients, pH gradients, which are proton gradients to create a proton flux to generate the basic building blocks from CO2 basically, and generate the organics all the way up to polymers, which unfortunately they've never been able to show in the laboratory. But this idea of a proton motive force is throughout life. So for example, our colleagues at NASA Ames, what they did, because you need a very thin membrane, this is how cells work, and there's electron transport going on. And there's things shooting one way and shooting the other way, and you have to have that. And so that was missing from the superficial sort of protocell model. So what they did was they ground up another meteorite that had the sooty stuff in it, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, because that can act as a pigment. And they sprinkled that into their lipid solution, some vesicles and layers and things like that, and hit it with ultraviolet radiation. That dropped the pH to 2 units down to pH 2. And then a proton gradient was set up instantaneously across the membranes. So what they discovered with that, and with quinones, subsequent work with meteoritic quinones have been showing that that's the first photocapture mechanism, which would have been the ubiquitous highest rate energy source available on a prebiotic Earth to drive processes. And that those processes can create nucleotides out of nucleobases. This is work by John Sutherland's group at Cambridge. So all of this is sort of coming together. We've got the electricity, essentially. We've got atmospheric synthesis since Miller-Urey day has undergone a change. So after 1953, there were a lot of people with spark chambers, and the typical horror movie depiction of science, right, was these spark chambers. And that kind of had its day and then dropped off the radar when the discovery of organics in the solar system. Like, oh, well, maybe that was the source. Our colleagues criticize us. We have to, I always ask the colleagues, I ask Mike Russell or Albert Ramstrom, what do you hate about our scenarios? What really disgusts you about it? And actually, Nick Lane at University College London said, we just don't trust that organic delivery. We don't trust it. We think it's dirty, even though we've ground up 4.6 billion-year-old meteorites and obtained these products. We don't think it's a reliable enough source. We need an industrial process almost to generate those amino acids. And it was a question until entered the Biogenic Atmosphere proposal, which was Miller-Urey coming back. If you have a big impactor that whacks the Earth above a certain size, models show that it changes the atmosphere chemically overnight, and that for several million years, the atmosphere becomes more like Titan's, where you have all of these organics, basically pathways that generate trillions of tons of material that then fall back to the Earth. And so there would have been phases where the Earth had a biogenic atmosphere generating enormous volumes of organics almost in a pure form. So these gaps are gradually getting filled in with proposals. And that's why it's been an exciting decade.
Thank you.
So that's electricity sort of returning, but it really big whacks.
Right.
Question here?
Question for you, Matt. Thank you for the nice presentation on metaphysics and the degrees of life. Because, in Whitehead's view, as you rightly put it, life is not an exception. It wouldn't be like going back to Derek's point too. I mean, you would expect, if Whitehead was right, that you would have more or less degrees of novelty of life, right? There's no need to have it being miraculous. You would be surprised if it was. It would be odd. It would be confusing if Whitehead was right. I'm wondering if you've also thought about the use of his concepts of society and nexus instead of, or in addition to concrescence, which, and the reason why I think that, just editing the Harvard lectures, he uses a couple phrases that he doesn't use in print, like the principle, the necessity of the environment, and he's pushing on this idea of, that he does have in print as well, that there's no absolute split between the inside and the outside. And I think the problem sometimes I have with the concrescence focus is it becomes rather individualistic. Like you look at the little cell, the little monad, and you analyze the phases, and I think it's easy to lose the fact that the environment is it, and it isn't the environment, that there's no separation. And society, to my mind, as a metaphysical category, is more likely to help to avoid that sort of atomization. So I'm just curious if I think it's a friendly sort of suggestion.
Oh yeah, I mean, in the chapter, there's probably 10 pages on exactly this issue, drawing on at the Harvard lectures, both volumes. I was thrilled to see some of the phraseology Whitehead was developing that didn't end up in any of his publications. So yes, I do unpack a lot of that, where his understanding of what I call environmentality is very much given articulation in his metaphysical notion of a society. We talk more about the origin of life scenario as basically suggesting, rather than one individual heroic cell achieving life, it's more of this heroic community of protocells that weren't individuals yet.
Because they're the only things that endure, right?
Right.
Societies,
Exactly.
we always have to, they're the only things that endure. So
Exactly.
the occasions.
Right. Flash in a pan.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. For any more? Sure.
I have a question, and I guess it's for both of you. Matt, you brought up the Whiteheadian notion that life is a matter of degree, right? And yet, Bruce, in your picture of the dream, you've got consciousness blocked way up there on the top. Is it not possible that consciousness too is a matter of degree rather than, or perhaps we're defining consciousness in a different way, but if life is a matter of degree, why isn't consciousness also on a continuum going all the way up your tower rather than plopped up on the tower?
I mean, these are terminological difficulties. Whitehead would want to preserve consciousness for very high-grade, animals that can compare what's actually given to possibilities. But experience, I would say, is a gradient, a matter of degrees that goes all the way down. But this might be a point of tension between Whiteheadian philosophers and scientists. So I'll let Bruce.
I think that's a good answer.
Okay.
Let's go to Dr. Delio, and then Steve, then we'll take about a 10-minute break.
I really like to hear this. My question is somewhat related. I was a little bit thrown off. Well, I totally agree with Kant's, phenomenology. Yet, I'm struck by the anthropocentrism of it. And therefore, I was wondering, given, I would agree, do we see consciousness in terms of turtles all the way down, so to speak, and Bruce's idea of microbial communities, building up. So there seems to be something that's going on that is communal in nature from the very beginning. So in light of this, I was wondering if we get out of Whitehead's, I love Whitehead, don't get me wrong, but the new materialisms and philosophy of new materialisms that have emerged, over the last number of decades, the work of Giles Deleuze and Phyllis Guattari, and then moreover, I was thinking of Karen Barat's work on meeting the universe halfway. And therefore, that we as knowers are not, in a sense, we're imposing the structures of rationality upon the stuff that we call matter, even if it has a level of consciousness, but that we are engaged in a network of known and being known. So the idea of transversality, the idea of tangential realism, or cuts being made between that which is encountered and that, So I was just wondering if you could give any thought to new materialisms within your paradigm.
Yeah, new materialisms and new panpsychisms. I'm really interested in that whole, Jane Bennett and others.
Just get worried about being too wedded to, I like Whitehead, but I don't want to. There's something about it, so it can be boxed in a little bit, and I want to, how do we contextualize the human within, our overarching concern as part of a network of knowing and being known?
Yeah, I mean, Whitehead's critique of Kant is precisely this anthropocentrism of the idea that human knowledge is somehow this unique thing in the universe. For Whitehead, knowledge is an especially intense and enhanced form of feeling, right? And some form of feeling goes all the way down. And so he breaks out of this Kantian enclosure that makes human cognition or human consciousness the unique source, like as if the objective world is in some way a construction of subjective activity. Whitehead says, no, the subject emerges from the world, and not just the human subject, but subjectivity of creatures at every scale. So, yeah, I think that's an important thing to break out of. As helpful as Kant can be as a step away from materialism, just to remind scientific materialists that they're pulling the rug out from under their own scientific enterprise. Right?
Yes.
But I don't want to stay with Kant. Once we've gotten them to realize that, then we need to move on.
Right.
So.
Let's conclude with Dr. Dick's question.
Yeah, I'm interested in this concept of durability because I haven't heard it before. Is that a concept that's becoming widespread in the literature, and
Hopefully
or is it
soon.
just your personal term? And is there? Can you explain is there a quantifiable difference between durability and habitability, or is it more just descriptive?
Yeah, so Dave Deemer came up with this term about a year and a half ago. We were part of a SETI event for the landing of Perseverance, and we realized our community needs a new word because they're talking about Mars's current habitability, but what about its ability to start life, and then life would migrate to the refugia of the rocks, and we realized we need a new term because the chemical conditions to start life are vastly different. So picture the early Earth where you saw that movie that we made of a Hadean pool. Right. If you dropped in a bilge dump from your luxury liner going by and full of its bacterium from wherever it's from into that same pool would probably extinguish those organisms.
Yeah.
So the early Earth may not have been habitable
It was horrible.
because it's too hot, it's too acidic, unless you have the just right extremophile, but a sort of a typical organism may not be pre-adapted for the Earth in its toxic state in the Hadean. So it's not habitable, but it's Earthable. And just as today, the Earth is not Earthable because, as Darwin said, organisms will eat. Like if we took our protocell material from Fly Geyser and we just left it out on a counter in an open vessel, we'd find nothing within a couple days because the bacteria would fall in and it'd just be gone. It'd be just completely digested. So in the paper, we went back to about 10 or 15 years of work and identified 28 factors for errability that go from the microscopic to the meso, the landscape of pools and conditions, to an entire planet, to a solar system factor. And that's what's in the paper. It's on the editor's desk now at Astrobiology. So it went through a good peer review. Chris McKay gave us a thumbs up as he thinks about this 24 hours a day. So that will come out, and next week at the Astrobiology Science Conference, we have a special session on introducing the term. Our colleagues are already using it, which is very cool. It just was needed. And so the exoplanet research community is our main target for this, because they've got these worlds of the rough classifications, which ones are Earthable. So you can take the TRAPPIST system with those 7 planets that are in the habitable zone, and you can take the 28 factors, you can add your own, propose your own. We have a graph system where we have strips that cross each other, and they shift around. And where they cross is an Earthable center for a particular chemical reaction or a later stage. But it's hard to visualize 28 things crossing each other, but they can move around. And as we do our experiments in the different hot springs, we say, oh my God, we can do 5 pH ranges, we can get this to work. So then the Earthable center, the box grew. So it's a new language, we hope. Then the community can have some discipline around their experiments. But you could do an Earthable graph for TRAPPIST-3. And one item might kill it. The fact that you don't have enough wavelengths of light might just kill it. So we'll actually have a metric we can apply to worlds where life can start. Those worlds may still have life seeded from elsewhere, but the panspermia approach. But I think it's going to be really valuable to apply this new language and metric and errability in the field of astrobiology.
Fascinating, thanks.
That's a great place to complete, I think, the first session.
Fantastic.
Thank you to all our presenters. Let's be back at 11:05.